sunny spaces, smiling faces, happy places. But every sunny space holds a shadow. Behind every smile are sharp teeth. And every happy place has something sinister lurking just below the surface.
Welcome to We Saw the Devil, the podcast diving deep into the chilling realms of true crime. Join your host Robin as she unravels mysteries that have left investigators baffled and armchair sleuths obsessed. Be forewarned, dear listener. We Saw the Devil is not for the faint of heart. Our unflinching exploration will take you to the darkest corners of the psyche and through the unimaginable depths of human darkness to unearth stark secrets to the harsh light of day. Nothing will be left untouched. Are you ready? Are you sure? We saw the devil.
Hello, everyone. You are listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm Robin. How is everyone? Did all of you survive your Thanksgiving? Over the course of my life, I have been to a variety of Thanksgivings with previous partners or friends or family, and it seems like it's generally a mixed bag of how fun it's going to be. Me, honestly, best Thanksgiving I have had in years. I did absolutely nothing. I had zero plans and did nothing of consequence whatsoever, and I cannot even articulate how badly that was needed. No awkward political conversations, no turkey, which, okay, you guys know how much I abhor the current administration, Trump, Vance, whatever. But I truly do not understand the hate that Vance is getting. I mean, other than him being an awkward freak show, for saying that no one really enjoys turkey. Because I have honestly been asking myself and the universe the same question for as long as I can remember. Do any of you guys actually enjoy turkey? So Thanksgiving to me doesn't really have any sort of excitement around it. There's far better food. When I lived in Maine, I would never go home for Christmas. My parents would sometimes come visit me, but on years where they didn't, I would order from this one Iraq restaurant. It was an Iraqi restaurant, Middle Eastern food. It was so good. And that was my Thanksgiving, and I preferred it. But yeah, no turkey. Sorry, that was a very long tangent devoted to how much I hate turkey. But for real, warranted. But yeah, I had an amazing Thanksgiving. There was no political shittiness, which did you guys have to deal with that? I'm sure this year in particular was going to be a pretty bad one in terms of rival political views. But honestly, now I can hold my own in a political conversation. What I cannot handle, what I absolutely cannot do is, when Aunt Becky sells essential oils or something like that, and random cousin or random aunt is trying to get you embroiled in their MLM, can't do that. That's what sends me over the edge. So instead for my Thanksgiving, it was just me, the dogs, and absolute blissful silence. It was wonderful. The most drama that I had came when my dog Jupiter, if you guys know me at all, you know that Jupiter is the love of my life. He is a German short-haired pointer. I am obsessed with GSPs. Obsessed. I have two. I've really started trying to get into baking, specifically learning how to make bread. I did the Thanksgiving grocery run. I had an 18 count of happy eggs. And Jupiter decided that 18 count box of eggs that I was going to use just, it had to die. It just had to die, I guess. It just needed to die. And what ensued was catastrophic egg violence. It was carnage. It was eggpocalypse. It was cleaning 18 whole ass eggs off of my hardwood floors. So I spent part of the day on my knees, not in a good way, and it was just not fun. But I guess that's on me because I chose a breed that regularly commits felony level property crimes. So that being said, how did you guys do? Any drama? I love drama. As long as it's not my own, I love hearing the tea. So if you guys had a rough Thanksgiving, and I mean this in a serious tone as well, I know that Thanksgiving can be isolating. I have basically myself and my wife, and, my wife is super, super, super close to her family, but I don't really have any family myself at all. I lost my parents during COVID. So I understand how lonely it can be. All I'm saying is that I understand that we're in kind of that stretch every year that can be really lonely and isolating for people who don't have big support systems. So if anyone needs anything, I'm always here. Feel free to reach out at any time. But enough with the Thanksgiving drama and the sappiness, because we are here to talk about other people's questionable life choices and decisions. Specifically for this episode, we are here to talk about the New York City police officer who spent his free time on a website called Dark Fetish Net. And if you guys recall, he was discussing in graphic detail how he wanted to kidnap, torture, cook, and eat various women, including his own wife. And his wife was the one who discovered all of this. And she did what any rational person would do. She copied everything, called the FBI, grabbed the baby, and pieced the fuck out. And then after is when everything got really weird. Because here's the thing. This cop, Gilberto Valle, he will forever be known as the Cannibal Cop. And I don't know if you kind of gathered, but that's not really a nickname that you want. But he never actually kidnapped anyone. He never hurt anyone. He never ate anyone. He never actually attempted to hurt anyone. He just talked about it online, obviously, a lot in horrifying detail. And the question that sent him to federal prison and then eventually set him free is this. Can you be convicted of a crime that only existed in your head? Spoiler alert, the answer is maybe. So today's episode is going to be the case of Gilberto Valle, the Cannibal Cop. And I think that what really sparked this episode, when it happened years ago, I actually covered this as kind of a live breaking news item, but I never actually really did a deep dive on it. And I've seen the documentary that he did. And what's been particularly interesting, though, is all of the legal commentary that's come out of this case. But before we get into all of that, let's just get really quick housekeeping out of the way. You are listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm Robin. Hi. If you're not, please follow the show. You can do that on Instagram at We Saw the Devil Podcast, on Facebook and Twitter at We Saw the Devil. And you can follow me if you want, if you're bored, care about what I eat, the pets that I have, the concerts that I go to, at Robin_WSTD. And then also, if you want ad-free or Patreon-only episodes, there is a Patreon as well. But let's go ahead and get into it. Our story begins back in 2012, and what I can only describe as the most nightmare fuel way a marriage can end. I think it's safe to say we've all been through our share of breakups, finding infidelity, that's always my favorite, find out they cheated, whatever reason. But picture this. You're going through your husband's computer. Maybe you're looking for tax documents, maybe you suspect he's cheating, who knows. But instead of finding evidence of an affair, you find, well, how about I read you what Gilberto Valle's wife found? According to court documents, she discovered thousands of emails and chat logs where her husband, a decorated NYPD officer, was discussing in graphic, horrifying detail how he wanted to kidnap, torture, kill, cook, and eat various women, including their friends. Now, I want to pause right here because I know what you're thinking. Robin, that's obviously a crime, lock his ass up. And listen, I get it. But here's where it does actually get a little bit complicated. Valle claimed that these were fantasies, role play. He was a member of a website called Dark Fetish Net, which, yes, is exactly what it sounds like, where users with, let's call them unconventional sexual interests and proclivities, would share stories and role play various scenarios. Think of it like fan fiction, but instead of Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy, it's about fucking and cooking people. His defense? I like to press the envelope, but no matter what I say, it's all fantasy. And you know what? On some level, that defense actually makes sense, because the internet is full of people writing disturbing shit they would never actually do. There are entire subreddits with tens of thousands of people dedicated to creative writing about violence. There are horror authors out there who make Stephen King look like Dr. Seuss. And while we're at it, how many of you have listened to a true crime episode and, there are a million memes out there about it of, oh my God, she's so stupid. She left behind a fingerprint that, on the door handle that way. She didn't think about that. I mean, how many of you have thought about committing the perfect murder just based on your interest in true crime and knowledge? But here's what makes Valle's case different and why his wife immediately called the FBI instead of just filing for divorce. These weren't just generic fantasy stories. Valle was using real names, real photos, his actual friends and acquaintances. He was accessing police databases to pull up their addresses, where they worked, their daily routines. He was sharing this information with strangers on the internet and negotiating prices for kidnapping specific women. According to the prosecution, one of Valley's chat partners, a guy in Pakistan named Ali Khan, offered to pay him $5,000 for one of his targets. They discussed shipping costs for getting a woman from New York to Pakistan. They debated cooking methods. And this is where I need to read you some actual excerpts from these chats, because you need to understand just how detailed and disturbing this shit was. Valley, using the handle MHAL52, told Ali Khan, quote, "Yeah, I really want her to be alive in the oven. I want her to experience being cooked alive." Khan responded, "Tie her in a hog-tied position and put her in an oven. She will be a cool meat." Valley, "No, she'll be trussed up like a turkey laying on her back, her hands tied in front of her, her feet crossed at the ankles and tied up, then the hands and feet connected, tied with cooking twine." Like, Jesus Christ. And then it gets worse. In another chat, Valley discussed one of his wife's friends. Let's call her Andrea, because that's what the court documents call her, and described in detail how he would abduct her, where he would take her, and how long he would keep her alive. He talked about using chloroform. He talked about soundproofed basements. He talked about giant ovens and pulley systems. So when his wife found all this, she did what any reasonable human would do. She copied everything, she took it to the FBI, she packed up their baby daughter, and she got the fuck out. The FBI moved fast. They analyzed Valley's computer, found approximately 40 chats they believed represented actual conspiracy planning, and then promptly arrested him. The charges? Conspiracy to commit kidnapping. And here's the kicker on that, though. In federal conspiracy law, you don't actually have to do the crime. You just have to agree to do it and take one overt act in furtherance of that agreement. One act. And according to prosecutors, Valley had taken plenty of overt acts. He'd looked up his targets in police databases. He'd visited one of them at work. He had brunch with another one. Granted, he brought his wife and infant daughter to that brunch, which seems like a weird move for a kidnapping reconnaissance mission, but I digress. He'd searched how to make chloroform on the internet. He'd given some of these women PBA cards, those little union cards cops give to friends so that if they get pulled over, the officer might go easy on them. Prosecutors argue that this was to gain their trust and to make them easier targets. So in October of 2012, Gilberto Valle was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. And America collectively lost its goddamn mind. Do you guys remember when this hit the news, when this case happened? I do, and I was absolutely obsessed. Valley's trial started in February of 2013, and it was a media circus from day one. I mean, come on, the headline of Cannibal Cop, that is tabloid heaven right there. The New York Post ran with headlines like NYPD stew as Cannibal Cop plots to cook and eat women. ABC News went with a little bit more muted, Cannibal Cop plotted to eat 100 women. But beneath the sensational headlines, there was a genuinely fascinating legal question at the heart of this case. Where's the line between fantasy and crime? The prosecution's case was simple. Valle wasn't just fantasizing, he was planning, and they had the chats to prove it. Their key witness was FBI agent Corey Walsh, who testified that of the thousands of chats recovered from Valle's computer, the FBI determined that 40 represented actual conspiracy discussions, while the rest were, quote, mere fantasy. Now, you might be wondering, like I was, how the hell did they make that distinction? Well, Walsh explained that they concluded a chat was fantasy when participants used the word fantasy, and concluded it was real when they didn't use that word, and when the two people were sharing real details of women, names, what appeared to be photographs of the women, details of past crimes, and saying that they were for real. So let me just translate that methodology there. We know it's real because they said it was real, and we know it's fantasy because they said it was fantasy. Fucking brilliant detective work there, guys. Like, I don't know how this is going to sound in the mic, but I am clapping because The defense tore into this logic, as they should, and pointed out that many elements the FBI claimed indicated real plots, like negotiating prices, discussing chloroform, sharing photos, also appeared in the chats the FBI dismissed as fantasy. In fact, one of the chats the FBI categorized as, quote, mere fantasy involved Valley telling someone he would kidnap that same woman, Andrea, that I mentioned earlier, and stick her in the oven while she's still alive at a relatively low heat. So, the exact same crime, the same woman, the same method, but one was real and one was fantasy. I mean, based on what? Overall vibes? And here's where the prosecution actually had some compelling evidence. It wasn't just the chats themselves, it was what Valley also did in the real world. Because don't forget, he'd accessed the police database, called Finest, over 100 times to look up women. He'd searched their addresses, their workplaces, their personal information, and he wasn't supposed to do that. As an NYPD officer, he was only authorized to access that database for legitimate police work. He'd physically visited some of these women. He'd met one for lunch. He'd shown up at another's workplace, supposedly to say hi. And then there was the chloroform search. Valley had visited a website, I shit you not, called howtomakechloroform.net. I mean, come on. That's not even subtle. That's like Googling how to hide a body and then claiming you were just curious about forensics of it all, right? Like, come on. Well, the prosecution also showed the jury Valley's internet history, which, as you can imagine, was extensive. Hours and hours of videos and images depicting women being tortured, cooked, eaten. Some of it was real and just straight up snuff film adjacent. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Randall Jackson, told the jury, Gil Valley's fantasy is about seeing women executed. The fantasies that he is engaging in are about seeing women sexually assaulted, executed, and left for dead. That's not a fantasy that is okay. And you know what? He had a point. Even if it was all fantasy, it was deeply disturbing fantasy. The kind of fantasy that makes you want to keep your children far away from the rest of the world. But here's the thing. Deeply disturbing and illegal are not the same thing. The defense's case was equally straightforward. This was all fantasy. Sick fantasy, sure, but fantasy nonetheless. Valley's attorney pointed out the absurdity of the prosecution's real plots. In one chat Valley allegedly took seriously, he described kidnapping a woman and taking her to his mountain cabin where he had a soundproofed basement with a pulley system and a giant oven big enough to roast a human being. Cool story, bro, except Valley didn't have a mountain cabin, or a van, or a basement, or a pulley system, or a giant fucking oven. In another real chat, Valley promised to deliver a woman to his chat partner in Pakistan. But neither Valley nor his supposed co-conspirator ever bought plane tickets, never made hotel reservations, never even discussed actual logistics behind fantasy roleplay. And here's what really undercuts the prosecution's theory. Valley and his chat partners would set specific dates for these kidnappings. We'll do it on October 12th. Then October 12th would come and go and nothing. No follow-up. No, hey, what happened? No complaints that Valley failed to deliver. Instead, they just move on to the next fantasy plot with the next woman, like the previous conversation had never even happened. The defense also tried to normalize what Valley was doing by showing the jury what dark fetish net actually looked like. They played a deposition from the website's founder, Sergei Marenkov, who testified that the site was created for fantasy roleplay and had tens of thousands of members. They even had their paralegal give the jury a video tour of the site to show them that Valley's behavior, while extreme, wasn't unique. There were hundreds of users engaging in similar conversations just about cannibalism, kidnapping, torture, and all of it claimed to be fantasy. The defense's argument was essentially, yeah, our client is a fucking freak. Yeah, he is. But being a freak isn't a crime. After 12 days of testimony, and I can only imagine how those jurors felt sitting through 12 days of this shit, the case went to deliberation. 16 hours later, the jury came back with a verdict. Guilty. Gilberto Valle was convicted of conspiracy to commit kidnapping and faced up to life in prison. The legal community and civil liberties advocates went apeshit. Because here's what just happened. A man was convicted of conspiracy to commit a crime based entirely on his online conversations and Google searches. No actual victim, no actual crime, no actual attempt at a crime beyond accessing a police database he wasn't supposed to use and having lunch with a friend. The ACLU and other First Amendment groups started raising alarms about thought crime. I mean, as you guys already know, the documentary about this case is called Thought Crime. Op-eds appeared asking whether we'd entered an Orwellian future where the government could prosecute you based on your fantasies. One columnist wrote, "It's time to defend the cannibal cop. He's a weirdo, not a monster. And the U.S. Attorney's Office means to roast him on the spit of prudery and overcaution." The case even inspired a Law & Order SVU episode because of course it did. If you didn't follow this case, I know you saw it on SVU. But for Gilberto Valle, this wasn't theoretical. This wasn't a debate about free speech and the limits of government power. This was his life, and he was facing life in federal prison for conversations he claimed were all fantasy. So Valle's attorney filed a motion for acquittal. Basically, he asked the judge to overrule the jury and throw out the conviction. These motions almost never work. Like, federal judges do not enjoy telling 12 citizens, "Hey, I know you spent weeks listening to evidence and deliberating, but you're wrong. Just, thanks though. Thanks for your time though." That doesn't happen frequently at all. But in June of 2014, over a year after Valle was convicted, the judge did exactly that. In a stunning 118-page opinion, the judge granted the motion and acquitted Valle of the conspiracy charge. Let me read you part of this decision. The judge wrote, "Despite the highly disturbing nature of Valle's deviant and depraved sexual interests, his chats and emails about these interests are not sufficient, standing alone, to make out the elements of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. There must be evidence that Valle intended to act on these interests." The judge went through every single chat the prosecution claimed was real and systematically explained why the evidence was insufficient to prove Valle actually intended to kidnap anyone. He pointed out that Valle lied constantly in these chats about his own identity, about the women's identities, about having equipment and locations he didn't actually have. If you're seriously planning a kidnapping, why would you lie to your co-conspirator about basic facts? The judge noted that the so-called overt acts, the lunches, the workplace visits, the PBA cards, were all equally consistent with innocent conduct as with conspiracy. I mean, think about it. If I meet you for brunch and bring my wife and baby and you're a friend, am I really scouting for your kidnapping, or are we just having brunch together? But here's the part of the opinion that I think is the most important. Quote, "The court is mindful of the unique circumstances of this case. A conspiracy alleged to have taken place almost exclusively in cyberspace, and in a context in which the defendant engaged in countless fantasy role-playing conversations. In determining whether the government proved beyond a reasonable doubt Valle's criminal intent, his specific intent to actually kidnap a woman, the fact that no kidnappings took place, and that no real-world concrete steps toward committing a kidnapping were ever undertaken, is significant. In other words, if you're going to convict someone of conspiracy based on internet chats, you need some actual evidence they intended to follow through. Not just disturbing conversations, not just Google or database searches. You need evidence of intent to actually commit the crime. And the government didn't have that. Now, the government did appeal this decision because, of course, they did. The prosecution had invested significant resources in this case, and they were not about to let it go without a fight. But in 2015, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the acquittal. The appeals court agreed that Valle's conviction couldn't stand because the evidence was insufficient to prove he actually intended to kidnap anyone. They wrote that the case presented a fact pattern that lies at the border of criminality. Translation, this was close, fam, but ultimately you can't send someone to prison for life based on fantasies alone. So Valle walked free after spending 21 months in federal custody. 21 months for a crime he was ultimately found not to have committed. So happy ending, right? Guy wrongly convicted, justice system corrects itself, everyone goes home and happy day. Not quite. Gilberto Valle's life was completely destroyed by this. He lost his job with the NYPD, obviously, as he should have. His wife divorced him and has full custody of their daughter. His name is now permanently associated with being the cannibal cop. I mean, just Google Gilberto Valle and see what comes up. None of it's good, I assure you. In a 2018 interview, Valle said he still visits Dark Fetish Net. He's unapologetic about his fantasies, which, I mean, I guess good for him. Like, that's probably not how I would have played it, but okay. The court found him not guilty, and he has every right to his private sexual interests, no matter how disturbing other people find them, I guess. But he also said something that I think gets to the heart of why this case matters. He said, I want a new life. I want to contribute to society. I want to have a job. I want to have a family. I want to be a dad. The problem is that even though he was acquitted, he's still the cannibal cop. That stain will never wash off. And then here's a fun postscript. In 2021, Valle published a horror novel. Because if you're already infamous for your disturbing, fucked up fantasies, you may as well monetize it, right? It's called A Gathering of Evil. And it's about, wait for it, a serial killer who kidnaps and murders women. I have not read it, and I'm going to be completely blunt. I will not be reading it. But according to reviews, it's apparently not terrible, which is somehow even more disturbing. But let's talk about why this case actually matters. Because the legal questions here are so fascinating to me. Because what is the line between fantasy and criminal conspiracy? Well, the law says that conspiracy requires an agreement to commit a crime plus one overt act in furtherance. But when the agreement happens in a fantasy roleplay forum, and the overt act could be anything from buying rope to Googling chloroform to just having lunch with someone, where is the actual line? I read a really fascinating journal article by Duke Law, and it makes a really compelling argument that conspiracy law's requirements are way too weak to protect against exactly this kind of case. The overt act requirement in conspiracy law is supposed to ensure that bad thoughts only become crimes when they pose an actual threat to society. But in practice, almost anything can count as an overt act. Making a phone call, driving to another city, Googling something. So if the overt act requirement is basically meaningless, and agreement can be inferred from context, so what you're left with is thought crime. You're prosecuting someone based on what they intended with very little evidence of actual intent to commit a crime. I mean, secondly, what about the First Amendment? The government has always maintained that conspiracy agreement isn't protected speech because it's not really speech, it's conduct. It's an act of agreeing to commit a crime. But in the context of online role play, how do you distinguish between I'm agreeing to commit a crime and I'm engaging in dark sexual fantasy with another consenting adult? The prosecution in Valle's case argued that they could tell the difference based on whether the participants used the word fantasy and whether they shared real details. But that's a really fucking arbitrary distinction. I mean, consider that there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people engaging in similar conversations online. People writing violent fan fiction, people role-playing rape scenarios, people discussing murder in the abstract. Are we going to start prosecuting everyone who writes disturbing fiction? Everyone who role-plays dark scenarios with other consenting adults? Everyone who Googles something disturbing? Because if we are, we're going to need a lot more prisons, right? Like, if we are, I know I'd be in prison. We're going to have to build quite a few more. And then lastly, what about the fact that Valle was a cop? You know, I glossed over this earlier, but let's be honest. The fact that Valle was an NYPD officer with access to weapons, police resources, and detailed information about potential victims, I mean, that absolutely colored how this case was perceived, probably the biggest factor of this case. If Valle had been some random IT guy, would the FBI have pursued this case as aggressively as it did? Would a jury have been as quick to convict? The prosecution repeatedly emphasized that Valle was a police officer, walking around New York City every single day with a loaded weapon, who had a primary sexual fantasy of seeing women mutilated and harmed in specific ways, horrific ways. And you know what? That is scary. The idea that someone with that kind of power has access and someone like that who could harbor these type of fantasies, I mean, it's legitimately horrifying and concerning, but it's also not a crime. We can't start convicting people for being scary. And there's also a darker question here about kink shaming and moral panic, too. Look, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that cannibalism fantasies are normal or healthy. They are not, and they are objectively disturbing as hell. But the reality is that human sexuality is weird and complicated and often doesn't make logical sense. There are people with rape fantasies who would never want that to happen to them in real life. There are people with kidnapping fantasies who would never want to be kidnapped. There are people with vor fantasies. Yes, that's what cannibalism fetishes are called. And these people have zero interest in actually being cannibalized. Fantasy is not reality. And when we start prosecuting people for their fantasies, we are entering dangerous territory. Because whose fantasies are acceptable and whose aren't? Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide that? The government argued in Valle's case that his fantasies crossed a line because they involved real people, real names, real photos. But people write fan fiction about celebrities, real celebrities, all the time. Some of it is disturbingly violent. Is that prosecutable? What about people who fantasize about killing their boss or their ex or that asshole who cut them off in traffic? Is Eminem going to go to prison? If thinking about violence is a crime, we're all criminals. But what happened to everyone involved in this case as a couple years have passed now? Well, Gilberto Valle, as I mentioned, published his horror novel and has done occasional media interviews. He's largely disappeared from public life otherwise, which honestly, I don't blame him. His ex-wife has maintained primary custody of their daughter and has stayed completely out of the media. Smart woman. The FBI agents and prosecutors involved in the case have gone on to other cases. No one got in trouble for pursuing what ultimately turned out to be insufficient evidence for a conviction. And the co-conspirators? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Do you guys remember Michael Van Hise, one of Valle's chat partners? He was also arrested and tried. But unlike Valle, his conviction was not overturned. He served a 70-month sentence, over 5 years, for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. And why did Van Hise's conviction stand when Gilberto Valle's didn't? Good fucking question. The evidence against both men was similar, like disturbing chats, some Google searches, accessing information, etc. The difference seems to be that Van Hise's judge wasn't as willing as Gilberto's to second guess the jury's verdict, which really drives home how arbitrary all of this was. Valle and Van Hise engaged in similar conduct on the same website, in some cases discussing the very same women. One walks free, one serves 5 years in federal prison. And that's just a coin flip. And what's also terrifying is that I did read up on Van Hise's case, and that's again why this is also arbitrary and so weird. Like, I have zero doubt in my mind that Van Hise actually would have killed and eaten someone. Like, I have zero doubt in my mind that he actually would have done that and was actively working towards that goal. Whereas with Gilberto Valle, I really don't believe that he actually would. I do believe that it was all talk and fantasy for him. But for Van Hise, I don't believe that it was, even though both men largely took the same steps. Does that make sense? Absolutely crazy. But there are some really fascinating academic papers written about this case. Again, the one from Duke Law Journal that I cited earlier. I highly recommend reading because it argues for strengthening conspiracy law's overt act requirement to prevent exactly this kind of case from happening in the future. And the author of that also proposes that we need to do that because, with online and more people able to form communities and so on and so forth, that this could be a reoccurring theme potentially in law. There was also another paper from Stanford Law School that basically examined how juries process evidence in cases like these and found that a lot of people tend to conflate disturbing with criminal, which, no shit, first of all. But if you put a jury in a room and show them 12 days of evidence about someone's cannibal fantasies, they're going to convict. They're going to think, wow, this person is dangerous and needs to be locked up off the streets. throw away the key. That's human nature. And it's exactly why we have requirements like proof beyond a reasonable doubt or innocent until proven guilty. The system is supposed to protect us from our own worst impulses, including the impulse to punish people for being weird or scary. In tying all of this up, you guys, I guess to take away from this particular case is that Gilberto Valle is not a sympathetic figure. He has deeply disturbing fantasies. He accessed information about women he shouldn't have accessed. He engaged in role play that, if you didn't know it was role play, would absolutely indicate someone planning some serious Hannibal Lecter kind of crimes. But he never actually did hurt anyone. He never attempted to hurt anyone, never took any concrete steps toward actually committing a kidnapping, beyond the kind of steps anyone could take, like Googling stuff, meeting people, thinking about it. This case represents everything wrong with how we prosecute conspiracy in the internet age. The overt act requirement is meaningless. The agreement element can be inferred from almost anything, and juries are asked to determine intent based on their gut feelings about disturbing content. That's not a criminal justice system, that's a panic system. And the scary part is that this case could happen to anyone. You might not have cannibal fantasies yourself, but you probably have some fantasy or interest or search history that, taken out of context and presented to a jury, could make you look dangerous. Maybe you Googled how to get away with murder because you're, into true crime listening to this. Maybe you wrote violent fiction. Maybe you're an author. Maybe you painted something and, looked up something violent. Maybe you engaged in role play with a partner that involves scenarios you'd never actually want to happen. Should you go to federal prison for that? According to the logic of Valle's prosecution, maybe. The Second Circuit got it right, in my opinion, when they said this case lies at the border of criminality. But here's the thing about borders, they are supposed to protect both sides. The government should absolutely investigate when someone appears to be planning a serious violent crime. Absolutely. But investigation is not the same as prosecution. And prosecution should require actual evidence of actual intent to commit an actual crime. Not just disturbing fantasies, not just weird Google searches, and not just being a creepy fuck with a badge. Because if we start locking people up for their thoughts, even their most disturbing, most uncomfortable, most socially unacceptable thoughts, we're not fighting crime. We're creating it. This case has always fascinated me in a very similar way to the Michelle Carter case out of Massachusetts, where, if you recall, she's the girl who was convicted of texting her boyfriend at the time to get back in the car and finish the job and kill himself. So she was charged for that. I really love comment sections. I love comment sections just to read and see how other people are feeling about things. I never comment on anything myself. I'm purely a lurker. But especially when it comes to criminal cases and stuff like that, I love comment sections. And I recall back in 2012, 2013, when this case hit the fan, I loved the comment sections because they were so deeply divided. So I went and I looked at some comment sections, especially after the documentary aired, which is still available. I think it's on Peacock, either Peacock or Paramount. Or was it Hulu? I don't know. I can't remember. I love y'all, but I'm not going to Google that right now. People are very deeply divided on this case. It's not just I see both sides kind of divided. I mean, genuinely polarized in a way that tells you a lot about how we think, right? About crime, punishment, and what people deserve. So I've noticed with this case, there are multiple camps. A lot of people believe he's obviously guilty. He was planning to kill someone and he got away with it. And this is probably the most common take, and I get it. One commenter wrote something like, if your husband is Googling how to make chloroform and discussing cooking you alive with strangers on the internet, you don't need a conviction to know you married a psychopath. And that is absolutely a fair point, random internet person. And Valle's wife absolutely did do the right thing by taking their daughter and getting the fuck out of Dodge, no question. Another person in the comments section said, just because he didn't succeed doesn't mean he wasn't planning it. We arrest people for attempted murder all the time. Why is this different? And I get that too. And here's the problem with that logic, though, is that we don't arrest people for attempted murder when they never attempted the murder. We arrest them when they, attempt it, when they buy the gun, show up at the place, pull the trigger, and miss. Valle never bought a rope. He never rented a van. He never scouted a location, never made chloroform. He just Googled it, which is something probably thousands of people do every day. Probably even thousands of Breaking Bad fans alone have done. On a post about this case on Reddit, one user said, "If we're going to convict people for Google searches and disturbing conversations, we better start building a lot more prisons because half the internet is guilty." I mean, fair. Someone else, "He's completely innocent and this is Orwellian." And what's interesting is on the flip side, you've got the hardcore civil libertarians who think that Valley is like a martyr for free speech. One person said, "This is literal thought crime. He never hurt anyone. He never tried to hurt anyone. He had disturbing fantasies and the government sent him to prison for it. That's fascism." And I have sympathy for this argument. I sincerely do. The idea that the government can read your private conversations, decide your fantasies are too fucked up, and lock you up for life, like that is genuinely terrifying. But here's where this camp loses me. They are ignoring the fact that Valley was a cop. He wasn't just some random Joe on a fetish forum. He was a police officer with a gun, a badge, and access to detailed information about potential victims, which he utilized. He was using police resources, the finest database, to stalk women and share their information with strangers online. One person pointed out, people keep saying he didn't take any steps toward committing the crime, but accessing restricted databases to get women's addresses and sharing that information with people who claim they want to kidnap them, that's a step. That's multiple steps. And honestly, that is true. Even if you don't think it rises to the level of conspiracy, it's definitely a fireable offense and probably illegal misuse of police resources. And I'm going to go one step further here. And I'm going to be completely honest. Had I been on that jury, I probably would have convicted as well. And I think that the step, what I would have considered an overt act, would have been him using the police database to run the private details, but it would have been sharing it with the other people that I've discussed the women with. Which legally, obviously, that is not an overt act, but in my mind, it should be. Because imagine, guys, your husband, right? Like imagine you go to your husband's computer, you pull it up, you see the chats, and that he pulled all of the personal information about your lifelong best friend. You have a close best friend that you're friends with, and he used the police database to pull up all of her personal information, address, workplace, pictures, everything, and sent it to other strangers on the internet who were also talking about raping and cooking and killing and eating her. That is just too much for me. And then a lot of people do talk about the fact that he is a cop. One commenter said, "If you're a kindergarten teacher with a sexual attraction to children, even if you never act on it, you shouldn't be a kindergarten teacher." Same logic applies here. If you're a cop who fantasizes about kidnapping and eating women, you shouldn't have access to a police database and a gun. And I think that's probably right. There's a difference between you should go to federal prison for life and you should not be allowed to be a police officer anymore. The problem is that our criminal justice system doesn't really have a middle setting. It's either completely innocent or decades in prison. And there's no, hey, you're a criminal. Hey, you're not a criminal, but you're definitely too dangerous for this job option. And then you've obviously got the folks that, usually people in the kink communities who argue that Valley's prosecution was fundamentally about punishing unconventional sexuality. People went off about the, the rape fantasies, BDSM role play, kidnapping scenarios, and all of that. The prosecution definitely weaponized Valley's sexuality against him for this because, there's a difference between, again, my opinion here, but there's a difference between rape fantasy role play and then detailed plans to kidnap real people who didn't consent to that or having their information shared. But my take is that everyone's right and everyone's wrong. I think the jury was right that Valley's behavior was deeply concerning and probably indicated some level of intent beyond pure fantasy. The evidence wasn't nothing. The chats were pretty freaking detailed. The database searches were real. The patterns were there. But the judge was also right that it wasn't enough for a conspiracy conviction because conspiracy requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt and that you entered into an agreement to commit a crime. And the evidence just didn't get there either. What we needed and what the system that we have couldn't provide was something in between, like some legal mechanism that says, we're not sending you to federal prison for life, but we're absolutely watching you. You're losing your job and you're going on some kind of registry because what you did was pretty fucking alarming, even if it wasn't criminal. But we don't have that. I think this case is so uncomfortable for so many people because the reality of it is that it doesn't fit neatly into any specific narrative. Simultaneously, Valle can be a creepy weirdo who absolutely should have lost his job, someone whose First Amendment rights were violated, a person who may or may not have had genuine intent to harm, someone who served nearly 2 years for a crime he ultimately didn't commit, someone whose acquittal might embolden actual predators, and someone whose conviction would have set a terrifying precedent for thought crime had it stood. All of these things can be true at once. And one Reddit comment stuck with me on this case, and someone wrote, "The scary thing about this case isn't the verdict, it's the fact that we have no idea what the right answer is." And that is exactly right. Because this case does sit at that intersection of free speech, public safety, sexual deviance, police accountability, and the limits of criminal law. There's no clean answer. There is no solution here, at least one that's simple. The jury tried to protect public safety and probably convicted an innocent man. The judge tried to protect civil liberties and probably freed someone who is actually dangerous. Both outcomes are defensible, and both outcomes are troubling. And that's why this case matters. Not because it gives us answers, but because it shows us how broken the questions are. We're using 18th century legal frameworks to prosecute 21st century digital behavior. And we're asking 12 random citizens to draw lines that legal scholars can't even agree on. That's not a justice system. That's a fucking Ouija board. And where does that leave us now? I genuinely do not know. I know that Valle's wife did the right thing. I know that Valle should not have been a cop, and I'm very happy that he lost his job. I know that the original conviction was legally unsound, and I know that the acquittal feels kind of unsatisfying, but that was also the right thing to do. And I also know that somewhere in America right now, someone else is having a conversation just like Gilberto Valle's. And we have no idea if it's fantasy or planning. We have no idea if we should intervene. We have no idea where the line is. And until we figure that out, until we develop better legal tools for dealing like cases that live here in this odd gray area between thought and action, we are going to keep getting results like this. Everyone's angry, everyone's unsatisfied, and no one knows where to go from here. And if you want to read some of the debates on this, just Google Cannibal Cop, specifically Reddit or anywhere else, any article on this. You will see, prepare to lose several hours of your life watching strangers argue. They are, bless their hearts, they are going hard on constitutional law and sexual ethics. But that is it for today, guys. Again, you've been listening to We Saw the Devil. I'm Robin. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to follow. You can do so at We Saw the Devil Podcast on Instagram, We Saw the Devil on Facebook, Twitter, website, WeSawTheDevil.com. And if you're interested, there is also a Patreon as well for ad-free episodes and Patreon-only episodes, and you can assist in picking show topics. That's it for today, y'all. Until next crime.